Hello, everybody. It's Rhiannon. Before we jump into this episode about the First Intifada, I wanted to make a quick clarifying point. Over the course of this episode, you're going to hear the three of us refer to being 11 months into the genocide. That's because we recorded most of this discussion during the month of September 2024. Of course, we are now in October 2024 releasing this episode. We are 12 months, over 1 year into this escalated genocide. Just wanted to make that point before we jump in. We really hope that you enjoy this episode, that you learn a lot about the First Intifada. Thank you. And of course, free Palestine and glory to all of our martyrs.
The people demand a ceasefire. The people demand an arms embargo. And the people demand a liberated Palestine! Long live our steadfast people, and long live the Intifada!
Hi, everybody. Salam. Welcome to the fourth episode of Popular Cradle. Today, we are talking about the First Intifada. I'm Rhiannon. I am here, of course, again with Yara and Muhammad. What's up, guys?
Hey, comrades. Excited to start this episode.
Hi, Rhi and Yara. So excited to talk about the First Intifada today.
So getting into our topic for today, the First Intifada is remembered in the West by these really iconic images that came out of the uprising. Palestinians throwing stones towards this occupying military, that military being armed to the teeth, tanks, everything. There's the images of the slingshot, the kufiyeh, the raised hand with the V for victory. It's also remembered in the West as completely depoliticized sometimes, almost like a random occurrence of events, when actually the First Intifada is born out of a specific set of conditions, including, of course, mass dispossession and occupation. So on this podcast, we talk a lot about the national liberation struggle, but that really means something material. It means something quite concrete and real. And the First Intifada provides a framework for understanding that political liberation. The First Intifada came together and was carried out by work across all social and economic sectors. It wasn't just a movement. It wasn't just a demonstration. It was an uprising. It was a combination of field work, organizational, political, economic, moral, cultural work, educational work, all of these pillars holding this uprising up. So our discussion today is about the First Intifada and how it happened, and also about what it meant for the Palestinian people to live out, to act out the central slogan: no voice rises above the voice of the uprising, no voice drowns out the voice of the uprising.
We should start the discussion with the term. What does Intifada mean?
Right.
And while the term has become primarily associated with the Palestinian uprising, the First and Second Intifadas, it actually originates not in Palestine, but in Iraq. And in the 1950s, when it was used to describe a mass popular uprising against the Iraqi monarchy at the time. And since then, it's been used throughout the region to describe moments in history where the masses of a given society rise up. And in fact, Intifada is not just used within the Arab or Muslim world. It's used to describe uprisings across the world, including, for example, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising during Nazi Germany's rule.
Yeah, so in Arabic, that's known as the Warsaw Intifada.
Exactly. And the word itself, its root word, nafad, actually means to shake off, to shudder. And here, the meaning of the word used within the context of an uprising means to shake off oppression.
Yeah.
And so, while the word Intifada within our contemporary discourse is used to vilify the movement for Palestinian liberation by people in halls of power, whether in Congress or by university administrators, often described as synonymous with genocide of Jews or violence or terrorism.
Yeah.
The word Intifada actually captures not a set of tactics, but a mass approach to overcoming oppression.
Right.
Yeah, that distortion of the term Intifada that you're talking about, You know, we saw it when there were congressional hearings with the presidents of universities in which congressional representatives, these politicians, were grilling the university presidents on, you know, the use of the word intifada by pro-Palestine protesters on their campuses.
When mobs or people are shouting from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free, or long live the Intifada, are those anti-Semitic statements? Yes or no? It's not how you feel, it's...
I hear them as such. Some people don't.
Well, actually, for her, it was the Infantada, apparently.
Yeah, that was the pronunciation by Representative McClain from Michigan's 9th District. And she's questioning their former Columbia University president, Manoush Shafiq.
The cheesy, beefy infantada.
Yeah, that's the new Taco Bell menu item. But in all seriousness, like, there is this call for the Palestinian movement to, like, give up these terms, right? When they're characterized as, like, evil and distorted, as if Palestinians are calling for violence.
Right. And I think this poses the question for us of, like, who does it serve for us to concede on a term? Like, we've been seeing this not only with the Intifada question, right? Like, globalize the Intifada or Intifada revolution, these chants being attacked. Suggestions that we should just find new chants, right? We saw this with from the river to the sea too. Like, and so the terminology becomes a contested territory in and of itself. And then you have these people who are essentially trying to frame themselves as friends of the movement, right? Like, oh, we support Palestinians, but like, can you actually just not use that term?
Right. Can you just package it nicer?
Exactly. Yeah. And like, that's a really good way to know someone doesn't support you when they're just like, but just don't say from the river to the sea. You know? Don't say Intifada. But I think, like, in all seriousness, for us as a movement and for us as a people, ultimately, we're not going to walk away from this term for 3 reasons. On the one hand, we have the refusal for us to, you know, cede ground at a conceptual level. Like you were saying earlier, Mohammed, this term quite literally means to shake off oppression, right? And so we, from a conceptual perspective, are not going to walk away from this term. But then there's also the reality that by trying to impose on Palestinians to let go of this term, essentially what is being demanded of us is to turn our backs on a segment of our struggle. And so it's not just, we're not only being robbed of land and life and our nation, but we're also being robbed of the very words that we use to describe oppression and revolution. And then I think the third element of this is that this term holds a really important historical value for us as Palestinians.
Yeah, it means something very concrete historically. It refers to the concept of shaking off oppression, and it refers to real historical events.
Right, exactly. And by refusing to give up on this term, we're honoring the past, the very memory of the First Intifada, which began in December of 1987 in the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza, where 4 Palestinians were killed and 10 Palestinians were wounded when a Israeli truck driver veered into a long line of cars that was carrying day laborers who were on their way back from work in the Zionist entity. And this spark, the martyrdom of these 4 Palestinians, is said to have been the starting point of the First Intifada, as it resulted in Palestinians responding in protests, which initially started in Jabalia camp, but they really quickly spread from Gaza into the West Bank.
Again today, all over the West Bank and Gaza Strip, young Palestinians rioted against Israeli occupation.
The, I think, first refugee camp in the West Bank that would respond was Balata, and then it would spread like wildfire all across the West Bank.
It's been going on every day for 7 days, and there's no sign that it's going away.
And while this event, that is an important starting point, right? Like for storytelling, like we love, as people, when we're looking at revolutionary periods, we love to look at a story and be able to say, this is the spark that started the revolution.
Yeah, pinpointing it to a single event or single occurrence and saying that's what started it all.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And like that can be great in a story, but it's also important that as we narrate that story, we don't fall into the trap of characterizing Palestinian revolution as spontaneous. And I think that this is a really good example of that. Like, while yes, the spark started in Jabalia in Gaza in 1987, the First Intifada wasn't actually a spontaneous uprising, but it was a response to the condition of ongoing colonization and dispossession that had been a reality in Palestine since the early 20th century.
Life under Israeli occupation became too intolerable for the Palestinians to take.
And so, from the perspective of continuous resistance, the response to this specific event was, in and of itself, an element of life under occupation, and the ability of the First Intifada to spread in the way that it did from Jabalia to Balata and then all across Palestine, and its ability to sustain itself for 6 years, because this Intifada would carry on for 6 years.
I want to pause and actually highlight that we're talking about 6 years, 6 long years of ongoing resistance, of various tactics and development of organization and so much more that was sustained by the masses of Palestinian society during this period.
Right, exactly. I mean, think about the moment that we're in right now. Like, we're in month 11 of what feels like a revolutionary struggle and a period. And like, think about the challenge of sustaining where we're at now. They were able to sustain for 6 years, and they were able to do so precisely because of pre-existing networks and like movement that had been being built within Palestinian society that were all able to spring up to guide the uprising and to move the uprising when the spark took place.
So maybe we should start by asking the question, what were the conditions that actually sparked the Intifada? So like, while this event, the killing of 4 day laborers is what we attribute to as the start, what were the conditions that actually gave rise to that moment? And I think like the story of 4 day laborers in a refugee camp on their way from 48 Palestine actually gestures at that.
Yeah, just talking about that event, like you have to ask, like, why were Palestinian day laborers coming back from historic Palestine, what had been established as the state of Israel, back into Gaza that day, right? And so you have to back up at least 2 decades, right? 20 years before the Intifada is said to have started in 1967 with the Nakba. That's the war that took place between Israel and surrounding countries around historic Palestine. And at the end of that war, what had happened is that Israel had occupied the rest of historic Palestine. Israel had occupied the West Bank, as well as Gaza and East Jerusalem, and also the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula and the Syrian Golan Heights. And so what you're talking about is another massive dispossession of the Palestinian people after the Nakba of 48.
And the establishment of military rule over those territories. And so you're talking about millions of Palestinians coming under Israeli rule, military rule.
Yeah, exactly. There were also developments outside of historic Palestine. Throughout the 70s, Palestinian resistance, led by the PLO, was based in Jordan and then Lebanon, which, of course, is on the border with historic Palestine. That made it easier to wage this guerrilla struggle against the Israeli occupation. But in 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon in order to destroy the PLO, and that resulted in the PLO being expelled to Tunis, which is thousands of miles away from historic Palestine. And that meant that those newly occupied territories, the West Bank in particular, became the front from which the Palestinian liberation struggle was being waged, right? And there's this realization among the Palestinian people in historic Palestine, but also in the refugee camps around historic Palestine, no one is going to come and rescue us. There isn't going to be some external force, whether that's a neighboring Arab country or anybody else, or the PLO from outside historic Palestine, that is going to put an end to this occupation. And through that, there starts to be this sentiment among the masses in Palestine to take up that national liberation struggle from where they are.
So you captured really well the historical context, these like central events in terms of defining the conditions that give rise to the centrality of the Palestinian occupied territories. But it was really the way that the occupation was actually imposed. The relationship between Israeli occupation and dispossession and displacement. What it ultimately comes down to is land and labor.
Right, Muhammad. The conditions of land and labor became the driving force for what would become the First Intifada. Like, for example, by the late 1970s, half of the land in the West Bank had been taken or settled and had become completely inaccessible to Palestinians. And up until this point, really, Palestinians had been really reliant on land and agriculture in order to sustain their lives and their communities. But the Zionists targeted agriculture specifically, and they targeted land specifically. So they not only removed Palestinians off of the land, right, as part of their colonial process, but they also then employed major restrictions on Palestinian agriculture. So, for example, permits and restrictions on selling to different markets. They imposed restrictions on the transport of produce. And I think most importantly, they imposed restrictions that would allow for the Zionist entity to control the water. So after 1967, after the Nakba, more than 85% of the West Bank's aquifers were taken and controlled by the Zionist entity. And so you had really the condition of land and the centrality of all of the things associated with sustaining oneself, right? Agriculture, water, and so on, start to be taken and imposed on by the Zionist entity. And this would really drive Palestinians towards a situation that became so untenable that it created the conditions for revolution.
Yeah, concretely, it means that Palestinians were not able to feed themselves. We're not able to control their own land. And when you're talking about that level of dispossession, you're talking about dispossession from self-determination and your sovereignty. And that's really connected to the labor conditions that were present at this time also.
And you're also talking about a peasant population that historically was deeply rooted and tied to the land. So it's not just an affront in terms of like the deprivation of your basic ability to sustain yourself as a people, but it's depriving the Palestinian people of something that's so central to their identity as being farmers and peasants who worked and lived and cultivated the land as a form of national identity. So transforming this population from a population that's tied to the land and living off the land into a reserve labor force that is used primarily towards specific Israeli industries.
Really at the core of this is because Palestinians are losing their land, they're reliant on wage labor. Like they need to now enter the economy. They can't engage in self-sustenance. And so what's taking place at this time is that Palestinians are being pushed off their land, but then they're being driven into a labor market that the Zionist entity itself holds control over. And they become, like you said, Muhammad, this sort of poorly paid and very mobile and precarious labor force.
Exactly.
And so they're being forcefully removed from their land and losing their agricultural sovereignty. And then they're also being pushed into a labor market that's heavily exploiting them. I mean, the fact that the spark of this intifada is day laborers that are coming back into Gaza from 1948 is exactly reflective of this very condition.
You know what's crazy about this? The fact that Palestinians are now forced off their land to become laborers is that the type of labor they're now having to sell is the same type of labor they would have done on their land. They're being forced into the construction sector, in the agricultural sector, but now in service of Israeli society. So they're building the settlements that are now being built on the land that's been stolen from them. They are farming the land that was stolen from them. But now instead, this produce is meant to enter into the Israeli economy so that it could be either traded on the global market or to feed Israeli settlers.
Yeah, and here the theft of land and the exploitation of labor aren't just economic questions. We're talking about the theft of sovereignty, of self-determination, and of the Palestinian nation itself.
These are exactly the conditions that are being shaken off when the First Intifada, breaks out in earnest. These are conditions, historical events in sort of a broad sense, and also daily, concrete, material conditions that are being shaken off. And so we shouldn't be talking about the Intifada as this spontaneous event.
Or why it happened.
Right. It's actually about how this spark is sustained through a 6-year-long revolutionary period.
So prior to this moment where these conditions that we just described led to the spark, there were attempts by Palestinians to organize within their daily lives, to meet their needs under occupation, and to confront, in a very narrow sense, aspects of the occupation. And so here we're talking about the formation of unions and worker committees. These are groups that formed prior to the First Intifada, some of them long before the First Intifada, to meet specific needs. So unions or worker committees formed to try to organize workers to address questions related to their workplace. Agricultural committees formed to develop an approach to address issues related to farming and crop production. Or student organizations formed to agitate around the needs of students on their campuses. These groups, previously unorganized, are having to contend with problems they were facing on a regular basis. And these committees are trying to, in a moment where their land is being dispossessed, where they're being displaced and subject to military rule, figure out solutions to meet the needs of a specific village or workplace or campus. These structures that are emerging during this period of occupation are actually transformed. And it's through this transformation that tactics, these really important tactics like strikes, tax withholding, actual confrontation, both armed and unarmed with the actual occupation, becomes effectual. It's through the actual organization of these people that is rooted in this long-standing experience where they're having to address their basic needs, that we actually see the emergence of a unified national movement during the Intifada. And these are the tactics that we really want to highlight because it's through their utilization on an organized level that we see a sustained Intifada over the course of 6 years.
Right. And one of these tactics that would become super central during the period of the First Intifada was around strikes and the refusal to pay taxes. And really, like, these were critical ways that the Intifada confronted the very infrastructure of occupation, essentially saying, like, we refuse for any of our funds, whether it be our labor or our taxes, to go into sustaining the very occupation that is oppressing us. And objectively, what the strikes, or on a day-to-day basis, what the strikes and the tax resistance looked like was essentially, specific months or days that would be called for the refusal to pay taxes. So, for example, in 1988, the taxation revenue during the uprising had dropped by 50%. You essentially had shopkeeper committees in towns that were organizing in order to bring different stores and Palestinian businesses together to basically say we refuse to pay taxes to the Zionist entity. And on the question of strikes, we saw something similar where essentially a key strategy of the resistance would be to withhold their labor. And so you saw this especially in those employed, for example, in civil service. So, for example, policemen, tax collectors, anyone working in a tax department were called on to resign. You had general strikes that were called for at specific days where Palestinian workers that had to go to work in the Zionist entity would refrain from doing so. And these strikes actually impacted the ability of Israeli companies to rely on Palestinians as that cheap reservoir of labor that we had mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, many of those employed were seasonal agricultural workers who were Palestinians that worked in Israel during peak harvesting seasons. And it's also important to mention here that the first months of the Intifada actually corresponded with the harvest period. And so these couple of weeks that the Palestinian laborers, the seasonal laborers, refused to go into work had huge impacts on the Israeli agricultural sector. So, for example, an Israeli agricultural company, Agrixco, lost $500,000 just in December 1987 and January 1988 for not delivering on British orders to purchase harvest. And this was as a result of the strikes.
Yeah, this is an example of like these tactics directly targeting the core of Zionist occupation and really challenging that colonial apparatus that had been imposed on Palestinians.
And it's basically about upsetting what the Israelis were attempting to do, which was establish what they would understand to be a model of coexistence.
Mm-hmm.
Sustaining an occupation over the lives of millions of people while also accomplishing the goal of colonial expansion. And so Palestinians had to essentially become ungovernable. And this is where civil disobedience became a primary tactic.
Mm-hmm.
You want to control our lives? Well, we are going to be uncontrollable. We are going to confront your occupation, whether it's your checkpoints, whether it's your tax remittances, whether it's working for your important industries, whether it's meeting your occupation soldiers on our land with rocks, with Molotov cocktails, with bullets, whatever it took to make the occupation unsustainable for the Israelis. And this is why the First Intifada becomes known as the Intifada of the Stones, and Palestinian children become known as children of the stones. The stone becomes a symbol of Palestinian youth who become active agents, heroes of our struggle, a symbol of Palestinian resourcefulness to use whatever means available to confront occupation, and a symbol of resistance that our whole society is mobilized to resist as a people. And through this process, through this period of confrontation with occupation, Palestinians themselves were transformed as a people, not just on a national level or on a mass level, but even on the individual level.
Yeah, that makes me think of this story of Maryam Abu Saadeh, who was a Palestinian mother. And at the time of the First Intifada, her son Iyad was killed for raising the Palestinian flag, which during the First Intifada was outlawed. And even raising the Palestinian flag is an example of this civil disobedience, this direct confrontation with the occupation. And after Iyad was killed, his mom, Maryam, recalled that before his death, he had told her, if I die, don't cry and let people pity you and say, look at this poor, sad woman. He said, quote, raise your victory sign and don't you dare cry for me. And so this is an example of the transformation that during the Intifada, each individual Palestinian was going through. For this mother, realizing the responsibility she had to her son and to her nation, that instead of performing grief in a certain way, that she would actually perform strength, that she would perform pride in her son for doing civil disobedience the way that he did. And by saying, my son made the ultimate sacrifice for our people. And now I carry on that sacrifice. I carry on that mission and that involvement in our national struggle by being strong, by my own emotional resistance.
Yeah, so now it's not only that his death has meaning beyond its relationship to his family or to his village. It's now a meaning for the nation. And also her grief, her mourning, his funeral is also now a funeral or grief or mourning for the entire nation.
Yeah, it reminds me of going back to the word intifada, that when the meaning of the word intifada is distorted, when we cede that we're not going to use the word intifada anymore, we are ceding as a people this meaning making, that there was this period in which every single Palestinian, our culture and our struggle was transformed, and this transformation of the meaning of those historical events for our people.
Yeah, and this transformation was across every sector and every class and every role within society. And I think, it really reminds me of the way that the role of women was transformed because of the Intifada. Prior to this moment, women were often, to the extent that they were organized or allowed to be organized, was in limited ways and specific classes of Palestinian women. And it related to charity giving, for example. So you had these organizations or these committees that were tasked with, for example, taking care of orphans or raising money for the poor. And these are usually affluent women from urban centers that played this role. But throughout the duration of the occupation leading up to the First Intifada, women of different classes, working class women, peasant women, became organized themselves in a limited way, starting to confront the reality of occupation as it pertains to their own everyday lives. They're watching their sons being martyred, their husbands being imprisoned. And so the question is what is their role? But before the Intifada, Palestinian society was still conservative, such that this type of organizing was radical. There was still a need to sort of confront not just the occupation, but your own society in terms of the role that you can play in confronting occupation. And the First Intifada actually completely upends that dynamic. Now, these organizations that were at a really early stage in their development evolved over time and became central features of the ability to sustain the Intifada for 6 years. The women's committees that were galvanized during the First Intifada started to play roles. So, for example, during the Intifada, schools and universities were closed down. And so women essentially, through these committees, began to organize actual classes, schooling within their own homes. They also were training each other to become medics, to actually treat people who were wounded in the confrontation with the occupation. They would organize support systems to transport families from their villages or from their homes to visit prisoners in Israeli occupation prisons. They would organize, and this is in conjunction with agricultural committees, for example, gardens that would actually allow for them to make up for this deprivation of land. And so it was the entirety of Palestinian society, every sector, every class that was mobilized to confront occupation. And what was so significant about this was that it was organic. It was built out of years of organization that was slowly developing to meet the everyday needs of Palestinians on a micro level.
Yeah, from the ground up.
But it didn't stay at the ground level. Actually, leadership became a central feature of sustaining the Intifada.
Yeah, I mean, that point around, leadership is going to play a central role in sustaining the Intifada. What we see emerge out of this period is UNLU, which is short for the Unified National Leadership of the Uprising. And this leadership body is comprised of 4 of the Palestinian factions: the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or the PFLP, Fatah, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the Palestinian Communist Party. And these 4 factions essentially had significant differences, but nonetheless came together in this unified effort in order to try to seize the moment and in order to shape what was clearly this kind of bottom-up uprising to ensure that it was coordinated and working in service of the national liberation struggle.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Parallel to UNLU, we also see the rise of the Islamic resistance movements within the Palestinian national sphere, specifically Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who would also come to play a leadership role external to UNLU, issuing their own sets of communiques calling for the liberation of Palestine through jihad and galvanizing Palestinians in the mosques. And so what would really emerge out of this is a kind of strong relationship between leadership and the people, where leadership is not just organizing in order to direct the people and to decide what the committees are and so on and so forth, but rather the leadership body, whether it be of UNLU or the Islamic movement, is actually coming together to say our people are rising up, and so we must be able to consolidate, we must be able to listen to the people, communicate with them, and ensure that the revolution, the uprising, is coordinated and is given all of the tools that it needs in order to sustain itself.
And it's not just that there was this coordination that would take place. There was coherence given to the Intifada. So you have here the various segments of your society mobilized to use the various tactics through different organizations and committees, all of which are tied to this leadership and tied to the specific faction themselves. In fact, each faction would have mass organization, what is described as a mass organization, like the committees themselves that were tied to the factions. But to give a meeting that actually captured the various politics and outlooks of Palestinian society towards a unified direction. And this is what we mean here by coherence.
Mm-hmm.
And so the leadership would do this through various means. First and foremost was the communiques.
Yeah, and to be clear, a communique is just a message from leadership to the masses in paper form.
So the unified national leadership of the uprising would issue communiques on a daily basis, printing thousands upon thousands of them and distributing them across historic Palestine. To give you an idea of how these communiques captured the politics and spoke to the masses, I want to read communique that was released. It was the third one actually released on January 18th. So here the Intifadas launched in December, and by January there's already 3 communiques. And this one actually blends together different politics. It appeals to nationalist politics, but also uses Marxist terminology, because here it's speaking specifically to the unions and the workers, Palestinian workers. And it says, to the Palestinian working class, yes, the arms of steel have succeeded through their participation in the strike in stopping the machines in thousands of Israeli factories and workshops. Your role in this uprising is unique and special. Continue your strike against work in Israeli factories, O heroic workers. We will not be frightened by the frantic threats uttered by the Zionist authorities, courts, and employers. For in this uprising, we have nothing to lose but our chains and the oppression and exploitation befalling us. And now this communique is much longer than this, but essentially what it's doing is it's giving meaning to the tactics that are employed on a popular level from the ground up.
And they're also really bolstering the revolution.
Mm-hmm.
They're moving it forward. They're re-energizing people around these tactics. I mean, we saw this clearly in, for example, the tactics that we mentioned earlier around strikes and tax resistance and civil disobedience, these kinds of things. I mean, there were moments where the communiques were central to the way in which these were being coordinated across Palestine. And so when we say, like, in 1988, there was this mass refusal to pay taxes, well, that was coordinated actually through a call from UNLU, communicated through the communiques itself. And the fact that so many people took it up showed just how widely distributed the communiques were, and also how widely read they were, but also it showed this relationship between the masses and the leadership, that while it was this bottom-up revolution, there were these moments in time where the people adhered to the call of the leadership. And this is going to be critical in sustaining the revolution, sustaining the Intifada. I mean, really, again, thinking about the moment that we're in right now, 11 months into a genocide, but also 11 months into a revolutionary period where people are mobilizing and organizing, we see even in this moment just how critical it is for political grounding, for communication with people and amongst movements that is sharp, that is clarifying, that continues to ground us in the developments back home, that continues to allow for us to coordinate. I mean, the communiques, the role of UNLU, the role of leadership in this period is so critical because we're talking about sustaining a revolutionary struggle, not for 1 month, not for 11 months, but for 6 years.
And this 6-year period is sustained not just through organization and confrontation and leadership. It's also sustained through cultural production, through music and art and theater, things that really capture the spirit of the Intifada. And in fact, the First Intifada produces some of the most important genres of music for the Palestinian nation. And this doesn't just take place through individual artists contributing in their own ways. Of course that happens, but it's actually organized. And so here, even artistry, cultural production is transformed in service of a national struggle. It's organized and in itself cohering on a cultural level the nature of the Palestinian struggle.
And this reorganization of life, whether it be on the question of culture, Muhammad, or even earlier how we mentioned work and strikes and the restructuring of Palestinian life around work in order to sustain the revolution. I mean, I think this is central to the way that the Intifada is organized. Like, what we see is a restructuring of all of society in order to sustain and serve the revolution. I mean, earlier we talked really briefly about the role of education. And Muhammad, you mentioned that in 1988, there was actually a military order that closed down all schools in the West Bank until further notice. And the logic that was given at this time was that they had become centers for organizing and stimulating violence. So this meant that we had over 1,200 schools that were shut down, affecting more than 300,000 students. And so, what did Palestinians do at this time? Well, they restructured the university. They restructured the concept of education. I mean, of course, there was elements of civil disobedience and resistance where, students would go to campus even though they were not allowed, and that would result in clashes with the occupation forces, right? But actually, the popular committees and largely women's committees would play a role in reformulating the role of education. Regular education became popular education. Things like tests and curriculum and grades were not really important at this time, but instead, education becomes this organic and community-based process that is about sustaining the revolution, that is about disseminating revolutionary consciousness and sustaining the revolutionary struggle, similarly to the role of culture, for example.
Yeah, it's this sort of like society-wide recognition that education is actually a revolutionary tool. And, I'm thinking about here we are in 2024, 11 months into genocide, but 11 months into resistance and a revolutionary period of our own. And there are a lot of really important lessons to be drawn from the First Intifada about how to take up those revolutionary tools, how to build a society-wide and international, a movement and a struggle with mass character where everybody knows and understands and takes up their role in the struggle.
Yeah, and I think we can draw a lot of lessons for the current moment that we're in when it really does feel like these 11 months, at least in the West, have transformed society. Like, we as organizers, as young people, as people who are coming into movement or people who have been in movements for a while are all being transformed over the last 11 months. We're seeing rules being built for everyone to take part in struggle, like organizations that are being built around confronting Zionism in the cultural sphere, right? Like writers that are producing literature for Palestine and fighting against the media's role in supporting and creating consent for this genocide. We're seeing healthcare workers and educators be activated in the current moment, and essentially these sectors that are being mobilized in service of the struggle. Now we are seeing labor unions starting to rise up to the task of engaging in internationalism and engaging in solidarity and refusing to handle weapons, for example, that are headed to the Zionist entity to continue its genocide. And so I think there's a lot of lessons that we can draw around what is our role in this moment in order to be able to build a mass movement and in order to be able to transform society in a way that brings so many people into the struggle around Palestine.
And I think that also some of the key lessons revolve around organization and leadership. It's not enough to activate the masses, to mobilize hundreds of thousands or even millions in the streets. Those people need to be brought into organization, and a leadership must emerge from the masses that is able to give direction, coherence, coordination, and consolidation of the politics that emerges and the organizations that transform the world around us. And so I think that's important to note, because there is, especially in our contemporary moment, there's a lot of antagonism towards organization and leadership. And that antagonism, I believe, comes from a place of distrust, of cynicism and skepticism, of past betrayal that's taken place by leadership. But it cannot be a substitute. Mass mobilization or mass participation cannot be a substitute for organization and leadership, because that is what is required to sustain movement and to sustain revolutionary struggle.
Yeah, and we've talked about this concept before on this podcast around Tarakum, right? Like this concept of accumulating experience, knowledge, history. In the case of the resistance back home, accumulating resistance itself in order to be stronger in upcoming revolutionary periods. And I think that concept applies to us in this particular moment, to be able to take these lessons from one revolutionary period into the next. But not all of the lessons that we learned from the First Intifada are positive. I mean, one of the most important lessons is also in relation to how the First Intifada was crushed. And what that lesson shows us is that repression is an unavoidable experience for Palestinians that are engaged in struggle. That when we engage in struggle and when we wage revolution, that we must also expect that our enemy engage in repression in order to try to stop that revolution. And in the case of the First Intifada, the Intifada was ultimately crushed through a range of tactics that the Zionist entity used, from arrests. I mean, we saw over 600,000 Palestinians arrested during the First Intifada, to the imposition of curfews to basically say to Palestinians across particularly the refugee camps that they could not leave their homes after specific periods of times or during particular times. We saw violent repression like tear gas, the destruction of agriculture, home demolition, right? I mean, in Beta village, 1 in every 16 homes was demolished.
Yeah.
And by the end of the Intifada, at least 5,000 homes across the occupied territories had been demolished. We even saw deportations take place, with Palestinian leaders, both from UNLU and the Islamic movement, deported to South Lebanon during this period. And so we saw this wide range of tactics deployed in order to quell our people's resistance.
And of course, one of the most important historical events that led to the end of the First Intifada were the Oslo Accords that started in 1993. And the Oslo Accords really represented the co-optation by leadership of the Palestinian revolution and capitulation to Western governments on this false promise of the establishment of a Palestinian state. But there's so much to talk about with Oslo. It deserves its own episode. So that is actually what we'll be talking about on the next episode of Popular Cradle. Popular Cradle is made in partnership with the Palestinian Youth Movement. Thank you to the many people who contributed to the making of this episode. Our editor is Soraya Shockley. Our artwork is by Shenbi G and Vivek Venkatraman. Our theme music is composed by Salma Talib and performed by Clarissa Bitar and Hisham Jarmakani. Follow, like, and subscribe to us on social media at Popular Cradle. That's YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram at Popular Cradle.